This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Angelo, this is such a treat for me. I adore you and your wife, Jeanette. And so to have this chance to talk about you, but especially about you being an Italian American, after the wonderful series that's aired on PBS and at WCTE on the Italian Americans. It's just gonna, you are just a wonderful, beloved person here in the Upper Cumberland.
Well, you're going to give me a swelled head, Becky.
No, I'm serious. You former president of Tennessee Tech. You were there for over a decade.
13 years.
13 years, and I know that the university really grew during your tenure. You went from an endowment of $1 million to $27 million. Right. You grew the university in academics and athletics, and really in that community family sort of spirit. And was that because that community family spirit is so inherent in who you are?
Yeah, exactly, Becky. First, let me say the feeling is mutual with you, Becky. Yeah, well, when I came to Tech, in fact, throughout my career, I always tried to let the people with whom I worked feel that, we're a family. We're all in this together, and let's see how far we can go. All pulling. I used to use the analogy: we're all in the rowboat. Let's keep our oars going in the same direction. And that was a product of my upbringing. Family was probably the most important thing to me and to all the Italian Americans with whom I grew up. I only have one sister, but our extended family was huge. I have cousins that we were like brothers and sisters. And of course, holidays, when Jeanette, who was not Italian, came into the family, the first holiday, there were about 25 people sitting around the table. I mean, it was just overwhelming for her. But that's the way it was when you were growing up.
Well, now, let's talk a little bit about that. When you're obviously not from Cookeville.
No.
Right? With your accent, you grew up in New York City.
I grew up in Brooklyn.
Grew up in Brooklyn.
Right? The neighborhood that I grew up in was probably 99+% not Italian, but Southern Italian. Just about everyone were immigrants who came from Naples, Calabria, Sicily, because that was where the living was very difficult, Becky. Northern Italy was pretty prosperous, but Southern Italy was very, very poor. And back in the early 1900s, that's when that wave of immigration came to the United States. And so where I was born in Brooklyn, actually when my parents came to this country from Sicily, they first settled in what was and still is Little Italy in Manhattan. And then after they got married, they moved to Brooklyn, where I was born. But my neighborhood, all the gals and the guys that I grew up with, we were all sons and daughters of people who came to this country from Southern Italy.
Wow. Did your parents, were they very young when they came?
Yes,
Okay.
but they were pretty much infants, 1, 2 years
right.
old.
So what inspired your grandparents to move?
Well, just the living was so difficult, looking for a better life. But it was kind of interesting, Becky. In the program, we will see that many Italians who came to this country, half went back because they came here seeking a better life, working, and either sending money back home or going back home. And that was the same case with my grandparents. They were only here temporarily. They were going back. Oh. Of course, they did not. They never did. Right. But as a consequence of that, being in Little Italy, it was like you just took your village, or as it would be called in Italian, the paese, and just transplanting it into Manhattan. So there was no need for my grandparents ever to learn how to speak English, because A, they were going back, and B, everyone with whom they met was also Italian. And so it was fortunate for me because my grandmother lived with us, and as I was growing up, I learned to speak Italian at the same time I learned to speak English.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, yeah.
So you still are very fluent in Italian?
Well, I was very fluent in Italian. I don't get much opportunity to use it here. But yeah, it's sort of like riding a bike. The times that Jeanette and I did go to Italy, after a day or two, it comes back. And you're able to speak fairly fluently.
Well, you were talking about immigrants, and it seems like every stage of immigrants have to sort of find their way.
Yes.
And there was a lot of discrimination for the Italians when they were first into America, right?
Right. My father would tell me stories that there would be ads that just flat out said, well, it used to be Irish need not apply. There was Italians need not apply. And when I was growing up, the Italians were on the lowest rung of the immigration ladder, and we hadn't gotten to the point where we were in the professions. Every teacher that I had from first grade to 8th grade was either Irish or Jewish. There were no Italian teachers when I was growing up.
Wow.
After that, the next step was the Italians went into the civil service. Police, firemen, sanitation men. And it wasn't until I was probably in college where you began to see the Italians getting into the professions. My church, where I went to church, it was a huge church. There were about 7 or 8 priests at any given time.
Wow.
And they were all Irish. There were no Italian priests until later on when I was growing up.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And so there was quite a bit of discrimination. And even up until back in 1966, during the time of the civil rights movement, I was applying for teaching jobs at universities. I had just gotten my PhD, and I had just shotgunned my resume all over. And one of the places was Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. And I didn't know who the department chair was, so I just sent it to the president's office. And then, a couple of months later, I'd given up hope on it. I was called for an interview. And the man who hired me, the head of the chemistry department, his name was Luigi Zumo Pollara. He came here to give a commencement address after I became president. And there was a senior professor in the department. His name was Salvatore Silvio Stavala. So when the chairman of the chemistry department through, I think there was a secretary in the president's office who was Italian American, and she says, you know, we got this resume from this young fella. And so he asked the president and the vice president, he said, well, how come you didn't send me this resume? You've been sitting on it for a couple of months. And both the president and the vice president, who were Ivy League Brahmins, said, well, we were afraid with Luigi Zumo Pollara and Salvatore Silvio Stavala, if we hire Angelo Anthony Volpe, are we going to have a chemistry department or a pizza parlor? No, absolutely, Becky. This is an absolutely true story.
Wow.
And this was back in 1966.
Wow.
Right. But on the positive side, tremendous strides have been made by Italian Americans over the years, especially after World War II.
Right.
You know, there was a bit of ambivalence with the Italian Americans at the beginning of the war.
Right.
You know, they were part of
yes, Mussolini.
Mussolini,
yes.
Right. And then after Mussolini was done away with, the Italians became on the side of the Allies. But more importantly, I think I was reading something about 10% of the army during World War II from the United States were Italian Americans. And the Italian Americans acquitted themselves heroically during World War II. And then, of course, when they came back after the war with the GI Bill, then that's when progress was beginning to be made economically, socially, and whatever which way for Italian Americans.
Well, I think, you know, of course, I just love Italians. I love Italians. And I want to go to Italy. I've never been to Italy. But when I go to New York, I always seek out places like Little Italy. And,
John's Pizza.
Yes, John's Pizza. You told me. In fact, we're going to talk about some of your favorite haunts in New York. But, you know, the Italians have brought this country so much in art and music and film and politics. Right. Share some of the people that you just know.
Well, you know, you can just go back in every area. You mentioned the arts and movies. Do you remember a director named Frank Capra?
Yes.
He was
yes.
a Sicilian, and he was one of the best directors in Hollywood. Won many Academy Awards. I think in order to be a singer in the United States, you have to be Italian.
Absolutely.
I mean, starting with Sinatra, Tony Bennett, Dean Martin, Vic Damone,
Yes.
and then of course in opera, Caruso, Pavarotti, Bocelli.
Right.
I mean, there is a tremendous history, and in industry as well. The father of the Ford Mustang, Lee Iacocca,
of course.
was the head of Ford Motor Company, and it just goes on and on.
In politics.
Politics. Wow. Yeah. Politics.
Well, you shared with me that there were Italians that signed the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, there were 2 Italians who signed the Declaration of Independence. Caesar Rodney, who was the first governor of Delaware, and in fact, in the quarters, the state quarters, on the back, the Delaware one, shows the ride that Caesar Rodney made from Delaware to Philadelphia to be able to sign the Declaration of Independence or have the vote for declaring independence. And that ride, they said, that while it's been lost in the mists of history, was just as important as Paul Revere's ride. And then there was a governor of Maryland back around 1780. His name was William Paca. P-A-C-A, who was also of Italian extraction. But back then, the Italians would settle in England and then came to the United States. And both Paca and Rodney were not Roman Catholic, as you might expect.
Right.
They were Episcopalians.
Right.
But later on, the Italian politicians were by and large Roman Catholic.
Right. And I guess New York, have they had a number of Italians?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can start out with Fiorello LaGuardia, who was mayor of New York, and probably the most prominent Italian-American politician of our history was Mario Cuomo, who flirted several times with running for president of the United States. His son, Andrew Cuomo, is the current governor of New York. And then there was an Italian-American governor in Massachusetts. His name was John A. Volpe.
Really?
Yes.
Any relation?
Well, I used to tell people we were the poor Democrat Volpes. John Volpe was the rich Republican Volpe branch of the family.
That's great. That's great.
But yeah, he was Secretary of the Interior in the Nixon administration, and then for many, many years he was ambassador to Italy.
Wow. Now, tell me about your high school, because you went to a really fairly large high school.
I did.
Didn't you?
We have 4,000 students at my high school, Becky. And a lot of people would say, well, New York City was a melting pot. When I was growing up, it was not a melting pot. It was like what we would say in chemistry, a solid solution. You had areas of 100% homogeneity, like the neighborhood I grew up, almost 100% Italian. Then you had a neighboring area, which was 100% Irish. Then you had another neighboring area, which to this day, Borough Park, is 100% Jewish. My high school was just on the boundary between the Italian and the Jewish neighborhood, and we had 4,000 students. There were 2,000 Italians, 2,000 Jewish students.
Wow.
Then I went to Brooklyn College. Now, Brooklyn College at that time was 90% Jewish, about 5% Italian, 5% Irish. And so I half jokingly say, when I went to Maryland to graduate school and I met my wife, I fell in love with Jeanette because she was so exotic. She was a Protestant. I did not know any Protestants growing up.
That's so great.
Right.
Well, and did she know many Italians?
No, right. We kid around. The only Italians her father knew were his barber and Frank Nitti, who was the gangster on the Untouchables.
Oh, how funny.
The program at that time.
Well, and there you had that stereotype a lot, right? In film and television, that all Italians were gangsters.
Right, exactly. Well, even to this day, that exists
Still that stereotype.
a little bit. Like a lot of times when folks will say, what's your background? I say, I'm Italian, but my parents came from Sicily. And you could almost see the first word that's going through people's minds: Sicily, Sicilian, mafia.
Yeah, right.
And of course, the Sicilian, no question, many of the mafioso were Sicilians.
Right.
But the percentage of Sicilians that were mafioso was so minuscule, but yet that's the stereotype that emerged from that.
Well, so in high school, were you a great student? I mean, you had this chemistry, you had a PhD in chemistry.
Heck no.
You were not a good student?
I was a goof off in high school. I mean, my language was Italian. I took Italian because I could speak Italian. And it wasn't until I got to Brooklyn College that I really bore down and said, this is what I want to do. I want to be a chemist. And by the time I graduated from Brooklyn College, I knew I wanted to teach chemistry on the university level. And from there, I went on. In fact, my first job with the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, the man that hired me said, because I had gotten my master's degree, and I was going to work for my PhD. He says, the reason I wanted an interview was to find out how somebody could do so poorly in undergraduate school and so well in graduate school. But it was just a question of goofing off, Becky.
Well, when you were in undergraduate, did you have a lot of friends that you just did you play sports
do a
and
lot of other stuff. And it came easy. I had skipped a couple of grades. I was 16 when I graduated high school. And, you know, I was really full of myself. I don't need to go to college. In fact, I told my father, I said, you know, Dad, I don't think I want to go to college. And he said, okay. My father was an upholsterer all his life. He says, you come to work with me. He had the contract to do the upholstery at the Blue Angel nightclub, which back then was one of the 3 most she nightclubs in New York.
Right.
He had the Store Club, 21, and the Blue Angel. And so he had me working. This Blue Angel had these tapestries all over the walls. Tapestries which had accumulated decades of smoke and grime. Yeah. And he had me tearing down these tapestries for a few days. And I'd go home at night, you know, like I was working in the coal mines. Yeah. And after about a week, I said, you know, Dad, I think I want to go to college. And he knew exactly what he was doing.
Right.
But I got a great story out of it. Say for a week, I was a stripper in a New York nightclub.
That's great.
But,
well, he was obviously a mentor. Did you have other mentors?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, folks say, did you plan on becoming a president of the university? I said, heck no. I had no idea that that's what I wanted to do. My father was my first mentor. He had maybe gone through 4th grade and then went to work. But he always had a passion for education. He said, I didn't have it, I want you to have it. Then at Brooklyn College, my freshman year, I took chemistry. My chemistry professor was just terrific, and he turned me on to chemistry. Then when I went to graduate school, the man that I did my doctoral dissertation work, you know, most times people get their PhDs, they say, I finished up hating my dissertation advisor. With this gentleman, Bill Bailey, who was his name, I liked him when I met him. I loved him when I left.
Oh, wow.
He was just fantastic. And then, of course, Luigi Zumo Polaro, who hired me, the man who hired me at East Carolina University, the man who hired me at Tech, as well as Wallace Prescott. You know, everyone knows Wallace Prescott in Cookeville. He was the best mentor that I could have possibly had when I came here. The best thing that happened to me when I came to Tech as president was Wallace planned to stay on for a few months during the transition. And I was able to wangle that up to almost a year for him to stay on. And the only argument we had during that time was, he said, Angelo, I want to leave. And I said, Wallace, I don't want you to go. So,
oh, that's so good.
Right.
Well, it makes a difference to have somebody really shepherding you,
No
doesn't
question,
it?
no question. In fact, he was so great in so many ways. When he introduced me to the faculty, he said, now, Angelo believes in shared governance. However, he reserves the right of veto power. Vito is his cousin, 6'2", with a broken nose, weighs 240 pounds. And the faculty laughed. They said, I think he's kidding,
Yeah,
but
right.
I'm not sure.
Well, how was it coming to Cookeville? I mean, this is very rural Tennessee, and you're an Italian, and you come...
It wasn't that bad. To me, the biggest change was when I left New York City to go to Maryland, to College Park, to go to graduate school, because that was really a change for me. And then after I got my PhD, went back up to New Jersey. But people forget that the 10 years prior to coming to Tennessee Tech was in Greenville, North Carolina, which was not that big a town, southern town. Right. So Jeanette and I were used to living in this. Of course, Jeanette, now she says she's not a southerner, but for someone from New York, someone who grew up in Maryland is a southerner. So it worked out fine. And Cookeville couldn't have been more welcoming.
Well, we're so glad you've made it your home. We're so glad you're here. Now, how did Jeanette fit in with all the Italians in New York?
Oh, she was perfect.
Yeah.
She was perfect, yeah.
And all the food?
Oh, yeah. She's a great Italian cook.
Is that right?
mean, she just learned, and she does a fantastic job cooking.
So what are some of your favorite foods?
Pasta.
Pasta.
Pasta. Yeah, Jeanette and I, we were talking one time, said if you had only one meal that you could have for the rest of your life, Jeanette being Scotch-Irish
Yes.
and Cherokee, potatoes, me, pasta. You give me pasta any which way, pesto, tomato sauce, clam sauce, yeah, as long as you just put it on pasta, I'm great with that.
When you were having those big family dinners, what would be some of the things on that table?
The first big Italian meal that Jeanette came was Thanksgiving. And it would start out with antipasto, and then soup, and then the lasagna would come out. And Jeanette at the time said, wow, that's pretty good. I guess Italian families don't have turkeys, but that was good. But then after all that, the turkey and the potatoes and the cranberry sauce.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, so it would just go on. The best times were Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. You know, back then, being Catholic, you did not eat meat on the eve. So you would have, on those days, the Feast of the Seven Fishes, where you would have fish, every different which kind of fish. And you would sit down, I guess, to dinner maybe about 6:30, 7 o'clock. And by the time New Year's rolled around at midnight, you were still sitting around the table. And you would welcome in the New Year. And then my mother, my aunts, they would go back in the kitchen and cook sausage, because now you could eat meat. So you would have sausage after midnight.
Oh, that's great.
Right? I mean, it was just a feast.
Now, there's an area we haven't talked about that the Italians had a great influence. And by looking at your tie with the New York Yankees, we haven't talked about sports.
Yes. Oh, you name it. I mean, there have been so many Italians. In fact, folks ask me, they say, how could it be you grew up in Brooklyn and you're such a loyal Yankee fan? Well, again, it was an ethnic thing. Being sons and daughters of Italian immigrants, the Yankees had Tony Lazzari, Phil Rizzuto, Frank Crissetti, Yogi Berra, and of course then the greatest of them all at that time, Joe DiMaggio.
Right.
The Dodgers had one Italian, Carl Furillo, and they had one half Italian, Roy Campanella, whose father was Italian-American. So, I mean, you were Italian, you rooted for the Yankees. There was no two ways about it. And of course, once you're imprinted at that early age, it stays with you.
Right.
And of course, Italians have just been in so many different sports. They have a terrific commercial on now. You know, Joe Montana, Italian-American, graduate of Notre Dame, and he has a commercial with these three other football players who were Heisman Trophy winners, and they were sort of making fun of him, giving the Heisman pose, and then Joe would just put his hand to his face with his 4 Super Bowl championship rings, and he'd go, oh, that's nice.
Yeah,
right.
I guess he can do whatever he wants.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, he being Italian-American, and there were so many different sports.
Right. Now, you go back to New York, you and Jeanette go back to visit family and friends, and so what are your favorite haunts there in New York?
Well,
that you just have to get back to?
Right. Well, most of the time it's visiting family. You know, and folks would say, "What's the best Italian restaurant you've been to?" And I'd say, "My mother's." You know, but there are so many good Italian restaurants. In fact, we hardly ever get to Lower Manhattan unless we're going to the theater, and where John's Pizza is, because there are so many good Italian restaurants now in the area.
Right.
As you know, we have a little apartment in Brooklyn, in the neighborhood where I grew up. So you've got your choice.
Right.
You name it. And now with my sister and her family living in Staten Island, there are a lot of great Italian restaurants there as well.
Do you just love New York?
Oh, yeah. And as much as I love it, interestingly enough, Jeanette loves it even more than I do.
That's great.
Right.
Do you feel like it's changed a lot? Do you feel like?
It has. It's changed for the better. You know, when we said earlier that the neighborhood that I grew up in was about 99% Italians, now it is truly a melting pot. Our neighbor to the right of us, where we have our apartment, is Russian. Neighbors on the left, Oriental. So you've got a real mix now. In fact, there's one area, Brighton Beach, which is not too far from Coney Island. It's called Little Odessa, because many Russian immigrants have settled there.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
cool.
it's while there's still a lot of ethnically homogeneous areas, there's more and more that mixing. In fact, Jeanette and I were coming from shopping one day. We were crossing the street, and there were 2 Muslim women crossing, there were 2 Orientals coming, and there were 2 Hasidic Jews going the other way. And I said, look at this, Jeanette, it's the United Nations over here. Right.
Well, we're going to run out of time. We could talk forever.
Yes.
But how important was it for you to see this, that PBS was doing this Italian Americans?
I just thought it was great. In fact, as you know, Becky, when I saw it was going to be aired, I called you and said, Becky, if there's anything that I can do to help, because to me, that program is going to be like looking back of, that's me growing up. Right.
And what do you want people to know about? What do you want them to leave this interview with about Italians?
Well, I think to a large extent, we have gotten away from the stereotypes. But what I hope would come out of this is that the stereotypes would be even more diminished. Probably back in those days, and thank God those days are pretty well past, probably ethnic slurs towards Italians. There were more ethnic slurs about Italians than I think just about any other group. Thankfully, you see less and less of that now. And that's what I think would come out of that people would see that Italians, like Irish, like German, like Jewish, have all become part of the fabric that makes this country great.
Yeah. I agree with you, and I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I'm glad we get to share you with New York City.
Oh, me too.
So,
me
thank
too.
you.
Thank you, Becky.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.